The medieval battlefield was an open-air laboratory for scientific discovery. For centuries, we have pictured these conflicts as pure chaos, but they were actually sophisticated experiments where the principles of physics, chemistry, and engineering were tested under the most extreme pressures. This journey will reveal how the brilliant scientific minds of that era transformed warfare from brute force into a field of applied science, and by the end, you will see the surprising parallels between their methods and our own modern research. We will uncover how a trebuchet's launch was a lesson in ballistics, and how a castle's walls were a continuous experiment in defensive design. What do you believe is the most enduring legacy of these ancient innovators? These master builders were the original systems analysts, meticulously observing how a wall crumbled or a gate held firm. Each siege was a brutal but invaluable data point, a live fire exercise that informed the next design. They worked with rudimentary mathematics and the materials at hand, stone, timber, and mortar, yet their process was strikingly modern. They identified a problem, proposed a solution in the form of a new architectural feature, built it, and then observed its performance under real-world conditions. The evolution of the simple square tower into the formidable rounded keep is a perfect example. Square corners were vulnerable, easily chipped away by mining or artillery. The rounded surfaces that replaced them could deflect projectiles more effectively, distributing the force of an impact. This was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual refinement, a slow accumulation of evidence gathered from the ruins of failed designs. The very shape of a castle became a testament to this empirical process, a physical record of trial and error written in stone. And as these defenses grew more sophisticated, the challenge they presented to an attacker grew exponentially, sparking an intellectual arms race that would push the boundaries of physics itself. While the master builder was reshaping the landscape with stone, another kind of innovator was working in the shadows. Behind the closed doors of the alchemist's workshop, far from the blacksmith's forge, a quiet chemical revolution was. These early scientists were not just seeking to turn lead into gold, they were experimenting with formulas that would change the face of warfare forever. Their most infamous creation was a substance known as Greek fire. This was not simple oil or pitch. It was a terrifyingly complex incendiary weapon that could cling to surfaces and even burn on water, making it a nightmare for wooden ships and siege engines. The exact recipe was a closely guarded state secret, lost to time, but we know its development involved painstaking trial and error. The alchemists would mix various compounds, observe the reactions, and meticulously record the results, a process that mirrors the scientific method we use today. Their pursuit did not stop with liquid fire. These same workshops became the birthplace of gunpowder. Through endless experimentation with saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, they sought the perfect balance for maximum power and stability. A mixture that was too weak was useless, while one that was too volatile could explode in the faces of the very soldiers who made it. Each batch was a data point, each accidental detonation a lesson learned the hard way. In their quest for controlled combustion, these alchemists transformed their cluttered labs into the direct precursors of modern weapons research facilities. They proved that the most decisive force on the battlefield was not always the strength of a sword arm, but the quiet power of a chemical reaction, meticulously understood and ruthlessly applied. This mathematical arms race unfolded in the open air, with every projectile's arc a lesson in applied physics. The trebuchet, a towering symbol of medieval engineering, was far more than a simple sling. It was a meticulously balanced system of levers and weights, a machine whose operation required precise calculation. The engineers who commanded these giants had to solve complex problems with every shot. How much weight was needed to hurl a 200-pound stone a specific distance? What angle of release would ensure the projectile cleared the enemy walls but still landed with devastating force? These were not questions answered by guesswork. They involved a deep, practical grasp of leverage, trajectory, and the structural limits of wood and rope. Builders used geometric principles to design these machines, and crews would engage in a process of tuning, making minute adjustments to the counterweight or the sling's length based on where the previous stone fell. A shot that fell short meant adding more weight. A shot that flew too far meant recalibrating the entire system. This cycle of launch, observe, and adjust is the very heart of the scientific method. It was a live fire experiment, repeated until the machine achieved the desired result. And with every precise impact against a castle's walls, the defenders were forced to respond in kind. The mathematics of destruction demanded an equally scientific approach to preservation, pushing the art of fortification to new heights of ingenuity. Centuries after his death, the ghost of Archimedes still haunted the medieval imagination. His legendary defense of was not just a story, it was a blueprint. He had used vast arrays of mirrors to set Roman ships ablaze with focused sunlight, and deployed a monstrous crane, the Claw of Archimedes, to reach out from the city walls, lift entire galleys from the water, and dash them to pieces. These were not myths of mere brute strength, but tales of intellect applied to warfare, of a single mind using the fundamental laws of physics to defy an empire. When medieval scholars began to rediscover classical texts, they found in Archimedes the ultimate model of the engineer-scientist. Here was a man who understood levers, pulleys, and optics not as abstract curiosities, but as tools for survival. This rediscovery provided a crucial intellectual framework, a permission slip of sorts, for their own experimentation. It proved that the most powerful weapon was not a sharper sword, but a better understanding of the world. The master builders and alchemists now had a historical hero, a figure who embodied the very principle they were exploring, that knowledge itself could be the ultimate siege engine. This revival of classical thought meant that the medieval battlefield was not just a laboratory, it was a classroom where the lessons of antiquity were tested, refined, and sometimes surpassed. The quest to master these physical laws would soon lead to an invention so profound it would render the castle itself obsolete, forcing a complete reimagining of how war was waged. While European engineers were refining the Trebuchet, a parallel revolution in military science was flourishing under the patronage of caliphs and sultans. The Islamic world, during what is often called its Golden Age, became a vibrant hub of innovation where scholars treated engineering not as a trade, but as a sophisticated intellectual discipline. In bustling cities like Baghdad and Cairo, these thinkers advanced knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics to astonishing new heights, and they applied this same rigorous thinking to the art of war. The brothers, three brilliant scholars of the 9th century, this spirit. They authored the Book of Ingenious Devices, a work filled with designs for automata and complex machines powered by intricate gears, hydraulics, and even steam. While many of their creations were marvels of entertainment, the principles they established had direct military applications. Their systematic approach to problem-solving, using precise geometry and physics to predict a machine's behavior, represented a leap from mere craftsmanship to true engineering science. This knowledge did not remain confined within one culture. Through trade routes, diplomatic gifts, and the translation of Arabic texts into Latin, these ideas slowly filtered into Europe. A design for an advanced water pump or a novel gear system conceived in Baghdad could, generations later, inspire a new type of siege engine in France or England. This cross-pollination of ideas reveals a crucial truth. The medieval laboratory of war was not a local workshop, but a global network of intellect. The relentless drive to understand and manipulate the physical world was a universal pursuit, one that connected minds across continents in a shared, if unspoken, scientific endeavor. The ideas born in Baghdad's workshops and Archimedes' treatises found a permanent home on the pages of sprawling technical manuscripts. These books became the silent, paper laboratories where the next generation of war machines was born. Before a single timber was cut or a stone was, a new weapon was first conceived and meticulously refined on parchment. A brilliant example is the written by in the early 15th century. This incredible volume was an encyclopedia of military technology, filled with detailed diagrams and instructions for everything from massive siege engines and gunpowder recipes to fanciful yet prescient designs for diving suits and mobile bridges. These illustrations were not mere fantasy. They were functional blueprints, repositories of both tested ideas and speculative designs that pushed the boundaries of the possible. They captured knowledge that could be shared, critiqued, and improved upon by a network of engineers and patrons across Europe. A flawed design for a trebuchet in one manuscript could be corrected in the margin of another copy decades later. This process of paper-based innovation was crucial. It allowed for the accumulation of technical knowledge across generations, preventing the need to constantly reinvent the wheel. A master builder in France could study the work of a German engineer he would never meet, building upon that foundation. These manuscripts paved the way for physical prototypes, transforming abstract geometry and physics into tangible power on the battlefield. But what happened when these paper designs were finally put to the ultimate test? And who were the people brave enough to stand beside these experimental machines as they roared to life? For the first time, these living experiments in stone created a constant feedback loop between attack and defense. A new siege engine would appear, and castle architects would scramble to find a countermeasure, a process that transformed each fortress into a permanent construction site of innovation. The simple arrow slit is a perfect example of this relentless refinement. Early versions were just narrow vertical openings, but defenders quickly realized they offered a limited field of view and fire. The solution was a brilliant piece of design. They began carving the interior wall around the slit into a wide, downward-sloping funnel. This created what is known as an embrasure, a structure that allowed an archer to stand well back from the opening, protected from incoming fire, while still having a wide arc to aim through. It was a direct application of geometry to solve a tactical problem. The same meticulous process was applied to the castle's most vulnerable point, the gate. The initial single gatehouse evolved into a deadly, multi-layered gauntlet. A drawbridge over a deep ditch led to an outer gate, which opened into a narrow, walled passage. At the far end stood a second, even stronger gate, often protected by a heavy iron portcullis that could be dropped in an instant. The ceilings of these passages were often riddled with murder holes, openings through which defenders could pour boiling water, hot sand, or stones onto anyone trapped below. Every single feature was a direct response to a previous failure, a documented weakness that had been exploited in some other castle, somewhere else. This was not random construction. It was a systematic, generation-spanning project in defensive optimization. The castle itself became a physical library of military science, its walls and passages a silent record of every siege that had come before. The roar of the first cannons did more than shake castle walls. It announced the birth of an entirely new science. With the arrival of gunpowder artillery, the medieval battlefield transformed once again, forcing the creation of a discipline we now call ballistics. The men who operated these early cannons were not just soldiers, they were experimental physicists in the field, conducting live fire research with every shot. They faced a chaotic web of unpredictable variables. The consistency of their gunpowder was often crude and uneven, leading to wildly different results from one charge to the next. The length of the barrel, the weight and shape of the stone or iron ball, even the packing of the powder, all of these factors had to be painstakingly observed and adjusted through sheer trial and error. There were no textbooks, no established formulas, only the immediate and dangerous feedback of a successful launch or a catastrophic misfire. Through this perilous, hands-on process, they began to map the invisible laws governing their new weapons. They developed the first practical understandings of what we now term interior ballistics, the science of what happens inside the barrel during the explosion, and exterior ballistics, the science of the projectile's flight through the air. Each shot was a data point. A ball that fell short meant a slightly larger powder charge was needed next time. A shot that veered wildly to the left might suggest an imperfection in the barrel's bore or an unevenly shaped projectile. This relentless cycle of observation and adjustment, conducted under the extreme pressure of combat, laid the entire groundwork for the precise mathematical science of gunnery that would flourish in the Renaissance. The cannon's thunder was not just a sound of destruction, but the sound of a new field of study being forged in fire and iron. Behind every charging knight and every towering trebuchet stood a less celebrated but equally brilliant mind, the Quartermaster. While engineers focused on breaking walls, these logistical masterminds faced a more fundamental challenge: how to sustain an army in the field. A force of 10,000 men, accompanied by thousands of horses and support personnel, was a city on the move, and it required a constant, predictable flow of supplies to function. The daily consumption rates were staggering. Imagine the sheer volume of grain needed for bread, the barrels of water, the mountains of hay and oats for the livestock. A single miscalculation could lead to starvation, mutiny, or a campaign ending in humiliating retreat long before the first arrow was ever fired. This was not a matter of simple guesswork. It required a sophisticated grasp of what we would now call statistics and forecasting. Clerks and commanders had to calculate consumption rates per man and animal per day, then project those needs over the entire duration of a march or a siege. They managed complex supply chains that stretched back to friendly territories, organizing wagon trains, river barges, and pack animals into a lifeline that could stretch for hundreds of miles. The successful siege of a castle was not just a triumph of engineering, but a victory of logistics. A defending garrison often hoped to simply outlast the army at its gates, waiting for hunger and disease to do their work. An army that could maintain its supply lines, however, could wait indefinitely, turning the siege into a war of attrition that the defenders were destined to lose. In this silent battle of supply and demand, the pen of the quartermaster, meticulously tracking every loaf of bread and every sack of grain, proved to be a weapon as powerful as any sword. Above the chaos of the battlefield and the clamor of the siege, a different kind of science was quietly directing the movements of entire armies. The night sky, a vast and silent map of stars, became an indispensable tool for any commander leading a force across vast and unfamiliar landscapes. During campaigns like the Crusades, where armies marched for thousands of miles through foreign continents, the ability to navigate was a matter of survival. Losing your way could mean stumbling into an ambush, missing a critical rendezvous with allies, or simply perishing in a trackless desert. The sun by day and the constellations by night were their only reliable guides. Commanders and their advisors used the positions of celestial bodies to determine true north, to calculate the passage of time, and to mark the changing of the seasons. Knowing when the winter rains would come or when the harvest moon would rise was not just agricultural knowledge, it was strategic intelligence. It dictated the start of a campaign, the pace of a march, and the timing of a naval landing. This application of astronomy transformed the sky itself into a grand strategic clock and compass, enabling the coordination of forces that were weeks or even months of travel apart. The success of a grand military endeavor often hinged not on the strength of its knights, but on the precision of its stargazers. But the most chilling experiments conducted in this open-air laboratory involved neither stone nor steel, but something invisible and far more terrifying. Medieval commanders, without any knowledge of germs or viruses, possessed a grim, observational understanding of disease as a weapon. Their tactics were horrifyingly simple, yet they revealed a cold, pragmatic grasp of biological advantage. The most common strategy was to pollute a besieged castle's primary water source, often by throwing the carcasses of dead animals into the well or upstream river. Another method was to use their own siege engines, not to hurl stones, but to catapult the corpses of plague victims or fallen soldiers over the defensive walls. The intention was to spread sickness and despair within the confined population, sapping their strength and their will to fight. This was a brutal, empirical science. They did not know why it worked, only that it often did. They observed that after such an attack, the enemy ranks would often be thinned by fever and death, achieving a military objective without the need for a costly direct assault. While we rightly view these acts as atrocities today, from a purely tactical standpoint, they represent a stark form of experimentation. These commanders were treating disease itself as a variable in their grim equation, a natural force that could be observed, harnessed, and weaponized. It was a dark testament to the relentless drive of the medieval mind to exploit every possible edge, turning even the invisible world of decay and contagion into a tool for victory. While the sky served as a celestial map, a far more perilous battle was unfolding in absolute darkness, deep beneath the soil. The ground under a besieged castle was not solid and safe, but a secret network of tunnels where a deadly game of cat and mouse played out. This was the domain of the Sapper, a specialized engineer whose work required a chilling understanding of geology and physics. His task was deceptively simple: to dig a tunnel from his own lines all the way under the enemy's formidable walls. But every inch forward was fraught with risk. He had to choose his path through layers of rock, clay, and sand, judging the stability of the earth above his head. He and his crew propped up their narrow tunnel with a wooden framework, a fragile skeleton holding back tons of crushing soil. One miscalculation in the placement of these supports, or a sudden collapse in unstable ground, and the tunnel would become a mass grave. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sweat, the only light coming from flickering lamps that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. But the silence was the most terrifying part. The sappers would often work in shifts of near-total quiet, stopping their digging to press an ear against the tunnel wall, listening intently. They were straining to hear the faintest scrape of a shovel or the muffled thud of a pickaxe. That sound meant the enemy had discovered their tunnel and was digging a countermine, a desperate effort to intercept them before they could strike. This was subterranean warfare driven by acoustics, a race decided by who could hear the other first. If the sappers succeeded in reaching their target, the final phase began. They would carefully excavate a chamber directly under the castle's foundation, pack it with barrels of highly combustible material, and then retreat, filling the tunnel behind them with timber and brushwood. When this was set ablaze, the fire would consume the supporting props in the chamber, causing the foundation above to drop suddenly. A whole section of wall, a tower, or a gatehouse could collapse into the resulting cavity, creating a breach for the attacking army to storm. This entire operation was a terrifyingly precise science, an underground experiment where the variables were soil density, structural integrity, and the speed of combustion, and the price of failure was burial alive. Yet the deadliest experiments were often conducted not on the battlefield, but in the sweltering heat of the forge. The blacksmith, coated in soot and sweat, was in truth a master of materials science, and his workshop was a laboratory dedicated to the transformation of raw earth into weapons of refined power. His primary challenge was a scientific one: how to make metal both hard enough to hold a sharp edge and flexible enough not to shatter on impact. This was not achieved by chance. Through generations of trial and observation, smiths learned to experiment with different iron ores, and crucially, with the carbon content introduced during the smelting process. They discovered that by repeatedly heating, folding, and hammering the metal, they could create a laminated blade with a complex internal structure. The most famous of these were the pattern-welded swords, their swirling surfaces not merely decorative, but a visible record of the intricate layers within, a design that combined a hard, high-carbon steel edge for cutting with a softer, more flexible iron core to absorb the shock of combat. The final, and perhaps most delicate, step was tempering. The smith would heat the finished blade to a specific, critical temperature, judged only by the color of the glowing metal, a brilliant straw yellow or a deep blue, and then quench it rapidly in water or oil. This rapid cooling locked the crystalline structure of the steel into an immensely hard state. A blade cooled too slowly would remain soft, while one cooled too quickly could become as brittle as glass. The difference between a legendary sword and a shattered one rested entirely on this precise control of thermal dynamics. Every superior weapon that left the forge was the result of this relentless, empirical pursuit, a direct translation of chemical and physical principles into undeniable battlefield advantage. The thunder of a trebuchet was not just a physical assault, it was a psychological one. Medieval commanders were masters of a grim and calculated science that operated on a battlefield far removed from stone and steel, the human mind itself. They understood that the ultimate target in any siege was not the castle wall, but the spirit of the people behind it. The will to resist could be eroded as effectively as any foundation, and they developed a chilling arsenal of tactics to do just that. One of the most direct methods was the of terror. The bodies of executed prisoners might be catapulted over the walls, a gruesome message meant to showcase the futility of further resistance. The sudden, deafening roar of a new and unfamiliar siege engine, its purpose unknown, could paralyze a garrison with fear more effectively than a volley of arrows. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were deliberate experiments in applied psychology. Commanders were testing how much horror the human psyche could withstand before it broke. Even the timing of an attack was a psychological lever. A wise general might delay his final assault for days or even weeks after his armies were ready. He was not just waiting for his ladders to be built, he was allowing the defenders' own imaginations to work against them. Inside the walls, fear would fester, hunger would gnaw. The constant tension, the sleepless nights listening for the attack that did not come, would drain morale more surely than any battle. This calculated manipulation of human emotion reveals a profound insight. These commanders viewed morale not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible, measurable resource, like grain in a storehouse or water in a well. They were systematically depleting that resource, treating the human mind as the final and most critical variable in their complex military equations. The crossbow's click and thrum signaled a revolution in manufacturing. This was not the work of a single artisan in a village forge, but a product of systematic, precision engineering. Its lethal efficiency came from the seamless integration of three core components, each a testament to specialized craftsmanship. The prod, the powerful bow-like limb, was a masterpiece of material science. While some were made from a single, carefully selected and tapered piece of steel, the most powerful were composite prods, built from layers of wood, sinew, and horn glued together under pressure. Creating such a weapon required a controlled environment, often a dedicated workshop where humidity and temperature could be managed to ensure the complex laminates cured correctly without warping or delaminating. Then there was the latch mechanism, or nut, usually carved from dense antler or cast from metal. This small, rotating piece had to hold the drawn string under immense tension and release it with a clean, instant trigger pull. The tolerances here were unforgiving. A fraction of a millimeter of wear or a slight imperfection in the carving could cause the mechanism to fail catastrophically, sending the string slamming back into the shooter's arm. Finally, the stock itself, often made from a tough, seasoned hardwood like oak, had to be shaped to perfectly house both the prod and the latch, aligning them with absolute precision. The entire weapon was an exercise in applied physics and repeatable quality. For an army to field 1,000 crossbows, each one had to function with the same reliable power. This demand for consistency pushed medieval industry toward standardization, creating an early blueprint for the assembly lines of the future. The crossbowman, in a very real sense, was not just a soldier, but the end user of a sophisticated, mass-produced technological system. The same principles of physics that shaped castles and catapults were tested on an even more unstable foundation, the open sea. Naval warfare demanded a completely different set of scientific rules, a mastery of hydrodynamics and naval architecture forged through relentless observation. Shipwrights were the unsung engineers of this aquatic laboratory, men who worked not with stone or steel, but with timber and tar, wind and wave. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of how a vessel interacted with the water. Through generations of trial and error, they learned that a hull's shape dictated everything: its speed, its stability, its very survival in a storm. A design that was too wide and shallow might be stable, but would be painfully slow, while one that was too narrow and deep might slice through the water quickly but risk capsizing in a strong gust. These were not accidents of tradition. Each curve of the hull, each placement of a sail, was a hypothesis tested against the brutal reality of the ocean. The evolution from the single-mast cog to the mighty three-masted carrack was a direct result of this centuries-long experimentation. Shipwrights were systematically solving for multiple variables at once. They needed a hull shape that could carry immense cargo for trade or house the weight of new cannon for war. They needed a sail configuration, a complex arrangement of square and lateen sails that could harness the wind from different angles, giving a captain the ability to tack against it, not just run before it. And they needed a rudder design, centrally mounted on the stern post, that provided superior control over the older side-mounted steering oars. Each of these innovations represented a leap in applied science, a better understanding of buoyancy, leverage, and fluid dynamics. The warship that emerged from this process was not merely a floating platform for soldiers. It was the most complex and powerful machine of its age, a direct product of the shipwright's silent, empirical research into the secrets of the sea. A commander's most powerful weapon could be a piece of parchment. In an era before satellites or aerial reconnaissance, the accurate map represented a staggering scientific and strategic advantage, a distillation of geography into a tool for conquest. Cartographers were not mere artists, they were intelligence analysts, synthesizing a flood of raw data from merchants, pilgrims, and explorers into a coherent picture of the world. Their workshops became clearinghouses for information, where a traveler's tale of a hidden mountain pass could be cross-referenced with a sailor's description of a coastal current. The process of creating a reliable map was itself a rigorous scientific endeavor, combining the principles of surveying with the art of draftsmanship. Using simple tools like the astrolabe and cross-staff, surveyors would painstakingly measure angles and distances, plotting the precise locations of hills, rivers, and settlements. This was slow, meticulous work, but it transformed the vague and often mythical landscapes of earlier maps into something a general could actually use. A well-made chart revealed the invisible architecture of a region, the strategic, where a small force could ambush a larger army, the hidden fords across a treacherous river, or the most defensible lines of retreat. It gave a commander that god's-eye view, allowing him to plan his campaign not as a blind march into the unknown, but as a series of calculated movements across a board he could see in his mind. The map, therefore, was not a passive record. It was an active instrument of war, a silent partner in the command tent that shaped the fate of armies and the borders of nations. Amid the chaos of the camp, another kind of experiment was unfolding in the surgeon's tent. The sheer volume of traumatic injuries presented a grim but undeniable opportunity, a live clinical trial conducted under the most harrowing conditions. Here, the high casualty rates of war provided a vast and tragic dataset for early physicians, forcing a rapid acceleration in practical medical knowledge. These battlefield surgeons, their hands stained and their tools crude, became pioneers of trauma care through direct, repeated practice on human subjects. Their primary focus was not on curing disease, but on managing catastrophic injury, a discipline learned not from books, but from the desperate immediacy of the wounded before them. Techniques for extracting deeply embedded arrowheads, for instance, evolved from brutal guesswork into a systematic art. A surgeon learned that a barbed head could not simply be pulled out, it would tear a man apart. Instead, he might use a specially designed spoon-like probe to carefully dislodge it, or if the shaft was still attached, push the arrow all the way through the body and out the other side, a terrifying but often life-saving procedure. The most common and drastic intervention was amputation. With no anesthetics beyond strong drink, speed was the only mercy. A skilled surgeon could sever a limb in under a minute, a horrifying spectacle that was nonetheless the difference between life and a slow, septic death. The immediate next step was cauterization, sealing the bleeding arteries with a red-hot iron or boiling oil. This was agonizing, but it worked. It stopped the bleeding, and though they did not understand the germ theory, it ironically helped prevent infection by searing the wound shut. This brutal, hands-on process served as a ruthless filter for medical practice. Superstitions and ineffective herbal poultices were quickly discarded when faced with the stark reality of a dying soldier. What remained, what was repeated and refined, were the techniques that produced survivors. This grim necessity separated effective practice from folklore, laying a foundation of empirical anatomical knowledge that would eventually inform the peaceful hospitals of later centuries. The surgeon's tent, for all its horror, was a crucible where the science of saving lives was forged in fire and blood. The true price of a medieval war was not measured only in blood, but in gold. A king's ambition was always constrained by the cold, hard reality of his treasury, forcing rulers to become masters of a brutal form of military economics. Every decision was a calculated risk, a balance sheet of potential gains against certain, staggering costs. The initial outlay alone was immense. To raise an army, a king had to pay for the recruitment of soldiers, the purchase of their equipment, and the vast stores of food needed to sustain them on the march. Building a fleet of warships required entire forests of timber and the wages of thousands of shipwrights for months on end. And then came the siege, the most financially draining endeavor of all, where an army of thousands might sit idle for a year or more, consuming supplies at a terrifying rate, all while the royal coffers bled dry. To fund these ventures, rulers employed every financial tool at their disposal. They raised taxes, often imposing heavy burdens on merchants and peasants alike. They borrowed vast sums from wealthy bankers and foreign lenders, pledging future tax revenues or even royal jewels as collateral. They meticulously allocated resources, deciding whether to spend limited funds on 10 more or on the engineers for a new trebuchet. This financial pressure created a relentless incentive for plunder. The promise of sacking a wealthy city or capturing a high-value noble for ransom was not just a bonus. It was often a necessary part of the business plan, the only way to make the war pay for itself. A campaign that failed to capture sufficient loot could bankrupt a kingdom, regardless of how many battles were won on the field. In this light, the royal treasurer, hunched over his ledgers by candlelight, wielded as much influence over a war's outcome as the general commanding the troops. His ability to keep the money flowing was the invisible foundation upon which every victory was built. Yet the greatest innovations were utterly useless if they remained locked within a single kingdom's borders. A breakthrough in French castle design meant little to a German duke facing a Magyar invasion unless that knowledge could travel. The transmission of military science relied on a surprisingly robust international network, a web of human and intellectual exchange that functioned as the medieval world's version of scientific publishing. The most direct vector was the traveling engineer himself, a master mason or artillery expert who would carry his hard-won knowledge from one patron to the next. These men were the original consultants, selling their expertise to the highest bidder, their minds a living library of and fortification. A single French architect could fundamentally reshape the defensive landscape of England by introducing a new style of rounded keep or a more sophisticated gatehouse design. Similarly, the grim reality of war itself forced the exchange of secrets. When a city fell, its most valuable treasures were often not its gold or jewels, but its captured artisans and engineers. A Byzantine expert on Greek fire, taken prisoner, might find his life spared in exchange for teaching his craft to the very Arab caliphate he had been fighting. This was not merely the spoils of war, it was a forced transfer of intellectual capital, a brutal but effective way for a rising power to leapfrog years of trial and error. The third, and perhaps most enduring, channel was the written word. Technical manuscripts like they were painstakingly and translated, moving from Latin to Arabic to vernacular languages, their diagrams and instructions spreading across continents. Behind this entire system stood the enlightened ruler, the patron who understood that investing in knowledge was more valuable than hoarding gold. These kings and caliphs actively sponsored the translation of foreign texts, funded the travels of scholars, and competed to attract the engineering minds to their courts. This constant, cross-border flow of ideas meant that a successful experiment in one theater of war, a new Trebuchet counterweight system in France, or a more stable gunpowder formula in China, could be replicated, tested, and improved upon thousands of miles away. The laboratory of war was not a collection of isolated workshops, but a single, interconnected global network, pushing the entire world toward a more scientific and more devastating form of conflict. A single man working in a Spanish scriptorium quietly changed the course of European warfare. Of Cremona, arrived in the 12th century, drawn by a thirst for knowledge he could not quench in his native Italy. He found himself in a city that was a living library, a place where the intellectual treasures of the Greek and Islamic worlds were preserved in thousands of Arabic manuscripts. Did not come to conquer with a sword, but with a pen. He dedicated his life to a monumental task, translating hundreds of these scientific texts into Latin, the common language of European scholars. His work was not merely academic. Among the philosophical and astronomical treatises were detailed manuals on engineering, optics, and mechanics, many of which contained direct military applications. Think of a European engineer struggling to calculate the trajectory of a stone from his trebuchet. Translation of an Arabic commentary on Archimedes could provide him with the geometric principles he desperately needed. Or consider a master builder puzzling over a new defensive design. Work could deliver to him the accumulated wisdom of Islamic architects who had been perfecting fortress walls for centuries. He was not creating new knowledge himself, but he was performing the most vital service of all. He was unlocking the door. By transferring this vast repository of advanced learning into a language European minds could understand, of Cremona armed a continent with the intellectual tools for its own transformation. His legacy was to turn the isolated experiments of the medieval battlefield into a connected, cumulative science, proving that the most powerful weapon is an idea whose time has finally come to be understood. This same experimental mindset was hard at work in the armorer's workshop. A knight's suit of plate armor was not a static costume, but a living document of empirical research, its final form shaped by centuries of brutal feedback. Each curve and joint was a direct response to a specific problem observed on the battlefield. The development began with a simple observation: chain mail, while flexible, was vulnerable to the piercing tip of a crossbow bolt or the crushing force of a mace. The first solution was to add solid steel plates to the most vital areas: the chest, the back, the shins. But this created a new problem: how to make a rigid shell that still allowed a warrior to move, to mount a horse, to swing a sword. The answer emerged through relentless iteration. Armorers became masters of articulation, designing overlapping plates connected by rivets and internal leather straps. They observed that a glancing surface was more survivable than a solid hit, so they shaped the breastplate and helmet with pronounced ridges and angled curves. Designed to deflect a weapon's point or edge away from the wearer's body, the gauntlet is a perfect example of this microengineering. Early mittens offered protection but robbed the knight of all dexterity. The solution was the fingered gauntlet, a marvel of miniature plate metal that allowed a warrior to grasp his reins, wield his weapon, and even pick up a small object, all while his hands remained encased in steel. This was not a sudden invention, it was a slow, painstaking evolution. An armorer would create a new design for a shoulder plate, and then wait for the knight to return from campaign. The dents and scratches on the armor were his data. A deep gouge in a specific spot indicated a weakness that needed a thicker plate or a more angle. A complaint about restricted movement in the elbow joint meant the articulation needed to be reworked. This continuous cycle of observation, hypothesis, and testing in the most demanding environment possible transformed armor from a simple protective shell into a highly sophisticated exoskeleton. A testament to the fact that the scientific method was being applied with ruthless efficiency long before it ever had a formal name. Yet this relentless march of innovation cast a long and troubling shadow. For every master builder perfecting a wall, there was a cleric questioning the morality of the weapons designed to breach it. A quiet but persistent debate simmered in scholarly circles and church halls, an early and profound struggle with the ethics of military science. At the heart of this dilemma was the crossbow, a weapon so effective it felt like a cheat. It allowed a common foot soldier to strike down a noble knight, a man who had spent his entire life training for combat, from a safe and anonymous distance. This act seemed to violate the very soul of chivalry, turning a personal contest of skill and courage into a detached, almost industrial act of killing. The Church went so far as to propose banning its use against Christians, a remarkable moment where spiritual authority attempted to regulate the direction of technological progress. The horror of Greek fire provoked an even deeper unease. Here was a weapon that burned on water, that could not be extinguished, that clung to flesh and stone with a terrifying tenacity. It felt less like a tool of war and more like a violation of the natural order, a descent into a kind of alchemical damnation. These debates were not about the legality of war itself, which was widely accepted, but about its methods. They forced a confrontation with a difficult question. Just because we can build a more efficient way to kill, does that mean we should? This was the medieval world grappling with the concept of disproportionate force, and with the unsettling realization that scientific progress could outpace the moral frameworks designed to contain it. The laboratory of war was not just testing materials and physics, it was testing the very conscience of those who stood to gain from its discoveries. This web of specialized knowledge reveals a profound truth about the medieval battlefield. It was not a collection of isolated skills, but a single, complex system where every discipline relied on another. A commander planning a siege was not just a warrior, he was a project manager orchestrating a symphony of different sciences. His success depended on his ability to make them all work in concert. Consider the moment a trebuchet launched its projectile. The physics of the machine's lever and counterweight had to be perfectly calculated by the engineer. The stone itself, if it was to shatter a wall effectively, needed to be chosen by someone with an understanding of geology, selecting the right type of rock for maximum impact. Meanwhile, the alchemist's chemistry provided the incendiaries that might be launched next to spread fire and panic within the fortress. And all of this was happening while the quartermaster applied his mathematics to ensure the endless supply of stones, timber, and food for the army, a logistical operation of staggering complexity. The most brilliant tactical maneuver would fail if the soldiers were starving, just as the most powerful trebuchet was useless if it ran out of ammunition. This forced a holistic view of warfare. The commander had to see the connections, understanding how a breakthrough in mining beneath the walls could be amplified by a sustained psychological campaign of terror against those living above. He was a polymath out of sheer necessity, a general who had to think like a physicist, an economist, and a psychologist all at once. This interdisciplinary approach feels strikingly modern. Today's grand challenges, from designing a sustainable city to planning a mission to Mars, require this exact same synthesis of knowledge. We are still learning the lesson the medieval commander knew in his bones, that the most difficult problems are never solved by a single field of expertise, but by the creative fusion of many.